Hello and welcome to this video on how I created this bio landscape in oil paints. So I start off this piece by adding 4 layers of thinned down gesso. In between these layers of thinned down gesso I'm sanding in between, only with a light grit sander, but just to make sure there's no lumps in between the layers of gesso. So once this gesso has dried, I begin by applying the first brush strokes with oil paint mixed with linseed oil. So the linseed oil allows the paint to flow easier and it helps to not dry too quickly. I like this because I can blend any forms I create underneath as the base layer. The linseed oil also helps to hide any initial planning or outlines I've made with the paint in the initial steps. In this case I did not plan any initial marks, or I didn't put any charcoal or initial drawings underneath the painting. So at this stage I'm sort of making things up with the kind of loose brush marks in this stage of painting. So I'm picking up the paint and just applying it with the same brush each time in this initial stage. I'm just making sure those contrasted areas are shown in this initial stage. I don't have much of an idea in my mind as what I'm going to paint or the final stage is going to be, but I'm just marking out contrasting areas that I think fit well with the piece at the moment. As structures start to form, I begin to develop a landscape of sorts in my mind. As I can see these forms appear on the canvas, the image grows stronger in my mind's eye. You can begin to see the hills and the valleys start to come alive in this stage. I add in the green hues to mark out where the water will be flowing. This is through a valley, I think, at the moment. And at this stage in the painting, I've sort of a nuclear, toxic or biohazard idea about the water. I wanted to portray this with the murkiness of the green and the browns in the stream. Even still at this point, the forms are still random and sketchy almost. There is not any detail at this stage, and a lot of medium with the oil paint makes it easier to manipulate and change if needed. There are little bits of the painting that you can see where my brush has gone over the paint with the linseed oil, especially on the right hand side of the painting. Paint is now sliding off these layers and it's revealing the white gesso underneath. So with this linseed oil it's creating thin layers as opposed to thick layers that are quite hard to work with. But with this you get the drips that you can see on the right hand side of this painting, which my art style, I like that. I play around with these strips, I play around with these abstract forms, and I do like that in my style. Some may have to reduce the linseed oil they use because they don't want them drips on the canvas, but to me I like this sort of loose abstract sort of forms that the linseed oil creates as well, so I incorporate that into my artwork. Here I'm working in details, creating the rocks at the waterfront and forming the first of the structure in the background. At this stage I have an idea of some sort of totem-like structure made of eyes looming in the background, and the rocks at the waterfront will be much more detailed at this stage. The contrast of these rocks will be much higher as they're closer to the viewer. So I'll leave this up to you, but you may want to change different brushes the more you progress with your painting. So, for example, the big brushes will be good for blending out areas in the initial stages of your painting, and then as you continue, smaller and thinner brushes will be better as you add more detail. I normally use either synthetic or even sable brushes, so I prefer their silky, their smooth texture they create. Some people also tend to use hog hair brushes for oils, but this is not always necessary. When you're thinning down the oils with the mediums, hog hair brushes will produce a sort of streak or brush marks in your painting as they are stiffer and less absorbent. If you like this, then great. Some don't like this result and prefer a much smoother approach with either synthetic or sable brushes. For me, in my practice, I much prefer these smooth synthetic or sable brushes. Here I am moving on to create a crater for a pool of water in the distance with a thinner brush for detail. Also, as a side note, some artists will use white spirit or turpentine to clean their brushes between colours, especially if the colour is extreme, like black to white. I normally just change paintbrushes when change colours, so I don't have these colours mixing in the palette or the canvas. It's just much easier to use separate brushes for extreme colour changes. I create the flow of this water running down the pool with a thinner brush. I'm using a lighter colour of unbleached titanium white and blending it into the flow of water below. As I've started with the sky in the initial stages of the painting, I'd like to come back to it later. So here I am blocking in the darker areas of the clouds with a darker shade. I am then using Naples yellow to highlight the clouds. I use this colour a lot in my paintings. So at this stage a lot of the under layers have dried. As I've worked on the clouds, the lower part of the painting has been allowed to cure. That means then going on top of this with more medium acts as a glaze. I'm adding more detail at this stage. I'm defining the rocks and the hills. I'm making sure the light is hitting them gently, making the sides facing the sky a little bit lighter. In doing so, I'm also defining those deep and dark contrasting areas with a glaze, basically defining those shadows that the rocks create as well. I've added a eye in the cliffside and also defined the base of the eye totem in the background. Moving on to the left side of the painting, I've added some tendril-like forms to the rocks. So I've created them with a kind of biological form in my mind, having the rocks that are solid take on a sort of soft human structure instead. I'm adding depth to the rocks and the biological formations by adding darker shades of the colour that is underneath the painting, so sort of the mid-tone colour darkened. This creates shadow, and when doing this I'm not adding solid colour straight onto the canvas. I'm mixing that colour with the medium with some sort of glazing properties. This can be either linseed oil. In this case I've used Winsor & Newton's liquid fine detail. It's great for adding a glaze and adding a transparent layer to form depth. I'm adding the highlights at this stage, thinking about the overall piece and where the light is hitting the landscape. Note that I do not over highlight. These are just small touches that are slightly brighter than the mid colour of what I'm using. This piece is quite an atmospheric one, so I'm sure to blend the highlights as the scene is a bit misty and the light source is not direct, so I don't want these highlights to stand out too much. Lastly, I add details to the totem, creating the eyes and picking out the highlights. I don't go too dark with the outline and details, as this totem is far away and will not be quite as clear. And there we go. That's the final painting. Thank you for watching.